Hey, Mr. Alex. Okay, if you remember correctly, in part one of chapter one, uh, Percy Jackson just had an encounter with Nancy Bobofit, and she ending up in the water, and she said that Percy had pushed her. So we're going to carry on from that at the museum and see what happens. Okay. Some of the kids were whispering, "Did you see the water? It grabbed her." I didn't know what they were talking about. All I knew was that I was in trouble again. As soon as Mrs. Dodds was sure poor little Nancy was okay, promising to get her a new shirt at the museum gift shop, etc., etc., Mrs. Dodds turned on me. There was a triumphant fire in her eyes, as if I had done something she'd been waiting for all semester. "Now, honey." "I know," I grumbled. A month of erasing workbooks. That wasn't the right thing to say. "Come with me," Mrs. Dodd said. "Wait," Grover yelped. "It was me. I pushed her." I stared at him, stunned. I couldn't believe he was trying to cover for me. Mrs. Dodds scared Grover to death. She glared at him so hard his whiskery chin trembled. "I don't think so, Mr. Underwood," she said. "But you will stay here." Grover looked at me desperately. "It's okay, man. Thanks for trying." "Honey," Mrs. Dobbs barked at me. "Now." Nancy Bobofit smirked. I gave her my deluxe "I'll kill you later" stare. Then I turned to face Mrs. Dodds, but she wasn't there. She was standing at the museum entrance, way at the top of the steps, gesturing impatiently at me to come on. How'd she get there so fast? I have moments like that a lot, when my brain falls asleep or something, and the next thing I know, I've missed something, as if a puzzle piece fell out of the universe and left me staring at a blank place right behind it. The school counselor told me that this was part of the ADHD, my brain misinterpreting things. I wasn't so sure. I went after Mrs. Dodds. Halfway up the stairs, I glanced back at Grover. He was looking pale, cutting his eyes between me and Mr. Brunner, like he wanted Mr. Brunner to notice what was going on. But Mr. Brunner was so absorbed in his novel. I looked back up. Mrs. Dodds had disappeared again. She was now inside the building at the end of the entrance hall. Okay, I thought, she's going to make me buy a new shirt for Nancy at the gift shop. But apparently, that wasn't the plan. I followed her deeper into the museum. When I finally caught up to her, we were back in the Greek and Roman section. Except for us, the gallery was empty. Mrs. Dodds stood with her arms crossed in front of a big marble frieze of the Greek gods. She was making this weird noise in her throat like a growling. Even without the noise, I would have been nervous. It's weird being alone with a teacher, especially Mrs. Dodds. Something about the way she looked at the frieze, as if she wanted to pulverize it. "You've been giving us problems, honey," she said. I did the safe thing, and I said, "Yes, ma'am." She tugged on the cuff of her leather jacket. "Did you really think you could get away with it?" The look in her eyes was beyond mad. It was evil. She's a teacher, I thought nervously. It's not like she's going to hurt me. I said, I'll try harder, ma'am." Thunder shook the building. "We are not fools, Percy Jackson," Mrs. Dodd said. "It was only a matter of time before we found you out. Confess and you will suffer less pain." I didn't know what she was talking about. All I could think of was that the teachers must have found the illegal stash of candy I've been selling out of my dorm room. Or maybe they realized I got my essay on Tom Sawyer from the internet without ever reading the book, and now they were going to take my grade away. Or worse, they were going to make me read the book. "Well," she demanded. "Ma'am, I don't, your time is up," she hissed. Then the weirdest thing happened. Her eyes began to glow like barbecue coals. Her fingers stretched, turning into talons. Her jacket melted away into large leathery wings. She wasn't human. She was a shriveled hag with bat wings and claws and a mouth full of yellow fangs, and she was about to slice me into ribbons. Then things got even stranger. Mr. Brunner, who'd been out in front of the museum a minute before, wheeled his chair into the doorway of the gallery holding a pen in his hand. "What ho, Percy!" he shouted, and tossed the pen through the air. Mrs. Dodds lunged at me. With a yelp, I dodged and felt the talons slash the air next to my ear. I snatched the ballpoint pen out of the air, but when it hit my hand, it wasn't a pen anymore. It was a sword. Mr. Brunner's bronze sword, which he always used on tournament day. Mrs. Dodds spun toward me with a murderous look in her eyes. My knees were jelly and my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the sword. She snarled, "Die, honey!" and she flew straight at me. Absolute terror ran through my body. I did the only thing that came naturally. I swung the sword. The metal blade hit her shoulder and passed clean through her body as if she was made of water. Hiss! Mrs. Dodds was a sandcastle in a power fan. She exploded into yellow powder, vaporized on the spot, leaving nothing but the smell of sulfur and a dying screech and a chill of evil in the air, as if those two glowing red eyes were still watching me. I was alone. There was a ballpoint pen in my hand. Mr. Brunner wasn't there. Nobody was there but me. My hands were still trembling. My lunch must have been contaminated with magic mushrooms or something. Did I imagine the whole thing? I went back outside. It had started to rain. Grover was sitting by the fountain, a museum map tented over his head. Nancy Bobofit was still standing there, soaked from her swim in the fountain, grumbling to her ugly friends. When she saw me, she said, "I hope Mrs. Kerr whips your butt." I said, "Who?" "Our teacher, duh!" I blinked. We had no teacher named Mrs. Kerr. I asked Nancy what she was talking about. She just rolled her eyes and turned away. I asked Grover where Mrs. Dodds was, and he said, "Who?" But he paused first, and he wouldn't look at me, so I thought he was messing with me. "Not funny, man," I told him. "This is serious." Thunder boomed overhead. I saw Mr. Brunner sitting under his red umbrella, reading his books, as if he'd never moved. I went over to him. He looked a little bit distracted. "Ah, that would be my pen. Please bring your own writing utensil in the future, Mr. Jackson." I handed Mr. Brunner his pen. I hadn't realized I was still holding it. "Sir," I said, "where is Mrs. Dodds?" He stared at me blankly. "Who?" "The other chaperone? Mrs. Dodds? The pre-algebra teacher?" He frowned and sat forward, looking mildly concerned. "Percy, there is no Mrs. Dodds on this trip. As far as I know, there never has been a Mrs. Dodds at Yancey Academy. Are you feeling all right?" Alright, that is the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is named "Three Old Ladies Knit the Socks of Death." And I will get into that probably tomorrow. I hope you enjoy Chapter 1, and I hope you get the chance to see this soon. I love you, Mr. Alex. Mwah! Can't wait to see you.